Good morning. Prime Minister Gordon Brown, it's a great pleasure to welcome you back to Davos. And I was thinking how I should introduce you, and actually, when I look at the World Economic Forum since 38 years ago, we have chosen a motto. And the motto was entrepreneurship in the global public interest. Now, introducing you, I would say you are the finest example of prime ministership in the global public interest. And you are not only the person who was behind the effective transformation of the UK economy, but you always had this global orientation expressed in your engagement for the Millennium Development Goals, and we will have today quite an important or very important session to boost the engagement of everybody behind those Millennium Development Goals. You are a fighter, and you have taken a number of initiatives to fight global poverty, climate change, and I could go on and on. So what I would like to do is to ask the Prime Minister, I will go back to my seat and ask the Prime Minister 3 questions before we start our plenary session on social responsibility. But I start immediately with my first question. Prime Minister, of course, during the first meetings, the situation of the global economy has been very much discussed, and we would be very interested to have your point of view. What steps should be taken to re-ensure that the global economy goes back to a path of sustained and good growth conditions?
Well, let me say first of all what a pleasure it is to be back at Davos, to thank you for your kind introduction, and to thank the audience here for being so patient because my flight was late in arriving. This is indeed a testing time for the global economy. I think it's also a testing time for all of us who believe in a globalization that is about open markets, free trade, flexibility, and inclusive, sustainable globalization. And I think it's a testing time because faced with what we've seen over the last few months, the underpricing of risk and then an aversion to risk, facing what I think we are seeing as commodity price rises and food price rises, particularly affecting Asia but likely to affect inflation in the rest of the world, but also facing what I think everybody knows around them, the insecurities that people feel as they see this rapid change in the transfer of industry, manufacturing and services across the world all the time, and the dislocation that it causes. There's a real danger that we fall for the 3 familiar responses that we've seen in past difficulties over previous decades. The first is to resort, when we see mistakes being made, to heavy-handed regulation, and I think you know the proposals that lots of people are putting about how we regulate in particular areas. I think that would be a mistake. The second thing is to resort to protectionism, and I think there is a danger, and I see it in America, I see it in parts of Europe, that people will resort to protectionism. And I think the third thing is simply inaction, to be gripped by or paralyzed into inaction, in the words of Churchill about a previous economic recession, to become, as he said, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, and all-powerful for impotence, and we must avoid that. There's also a danger, I think, with bad news still to come, of being over-optimistic about what we can be achieved. And overemphasizing the silver linings at the expense of some of the clouds, rather like the policeman looking at the body of a casualty and saying the first 2 wounds are fatal, but the rest are not so bad. What would I do? I would do 3 things. First of all, in place of protests for regulation, I would emphasize the importance of transparency. I think what we've seen over the last few months is a problem in the underpricing of risk that is actually a problem in the, if you like, the misunderstanding of risk. And I think the greater transparency and the greater informed markets we have, the better. So we've had too much off-balance sheet activity. We've had too little independent assessment of risk. I think we're seeing too little independent valuation of write-offs that companies are now having to do. I think there's been too much emphasis by the regulators on solvency and not on liquidity. And I think there's a bigger issue here, that we've got national supervision in a world of global financial flows. And if anything is true, there's not enough globalization, there's not been enough contact between regulators, supervisors, and a recognition that we're going to have global institutions where we have global flows of capital, global markets, and global companies. And I would say that the world needs most of all, perhaps, in the longer run, a better early warning system so that people around the world can be in far greater communication about what the risks are, how we deal with them, and how in particular we deal with the loss of the lack of information that led, I think, to the underpricing of risk continuing over a longer period than was necessary. Just 2 other things. One is obviously monetary and fiscal policy has got to be right. We've got to be vigilant. We've also got to be resilient in recognizing that the world will probably will grow as an economy by 3 to 4% this year. And finally, I think we must avoid this protectionism. We must be champions of free trade. When I see people saying that sovereign wealth funds should be regulated in a quite different way from other funds, and yet we have the assurances from the countries that they're going to be open, transparent and commercial and not political, I think we should be less protectionist in our attitude to that and to other aspects of the world economy at the moment. And I think the challenge for us over the next few months is to show that we can actually make the world trade talks work, to move the world economy forward, and to make sure that the protectionist sentiment that undoubtedly is a reaction to people's insecurity can be avoided. So getting monetary and fiscal policy right, far greater transparency both now and for the future, so that people understand risks better, and making sure that we don't resort to protectionism. I think that is a message that all of us should learn. And those of us who support an open and free and inclusive and, if you like, free trade globalization, we should not, in the moment of its challenge, take fright. We should defend it and advance it. We should not be, if you like the Salvation Army taking to its heels on the days of judgment. We should be clear that we are in favor of open and free market and inclusive globalization.
Prime Minister, to pursue those policies you need the appropriate international institutions and systems. Do you feel that what we have now, those organizations are still appropriate, or what reforms would you suggest?
This is a big challenge for the future. I mean, let's be honest, we're dealing with institutions that were created in 1945 or in the 1940s, that were for a world of 50 states, that were for sheltered economies, and were for national flows of capital and not global flows of capital. So we're dealing with institutions in the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations, for that matter, which were built for problems of the 1940s and can't deal with the new problems that we have in 2008. And the new problems are not just globalization at an economic level, but climate change, where we don't have the proper international mechanisms for dealing with it. Conflict-ridden states, failed states, we don't have proper mechanisms for dealing with the problems that arise where we have failed states. We don't have proper mechanisms either for dealing with terrorism that is non-state terrorism. We have global public problems like global pandemics that may hit us, and we're not properly prepared for that. And I don't think we've woken up to the sheer power of the internet. If you go to China or India at the moment, as I was last week, the millions of people that are about to use or are using the internet, the power that that gives them to express their views, the difference that that's going to have to make to world governance in the future, these 6 big changes, I don't think any of our global institutions have yet woken up to. So I would say that we're in a period where if we don't reform, institutions will become irrelevant, that new ideas are vital now to deal with the problems that are new themselves. And I would say three big changes are necessary almost immediately. One is in the United Nations. So we need to combine humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, reconstruction and development. And we need a civilian and military standby agency, a rapid response agency, where countries are in difficulty, then we can actually act immediately. And you don't just send in peacekeepers and armed forces, you send in the police and the lawyers and those people who can help rebuild civil society. And if the world can't come to terms with that, then the suffering that has existed in countries from Rwanda to Bosnia that went on for years without action will be repeated again and again. The second is making the IMF an early warning system for the world economy and creating the sort of institutions that recognize we have global financial flows. And I think the third is in the environment. I can't see why we should not move immediately to the World Bank becoming a World Bank for the environment as well as development. We need a global carbon market. We need a new climate change agreement. If we're to wake up to these problems, we've got to make these big changes also. But we need an institution that is global, that can provide funds for developing countries that want to introduce alternative sources of energy and want to move to greater energy efficiency, and will not do so and will simply build coal-fired power stations or whatever unless they have an institution that is able to loan or give grants or at least help them make alternative sources of energy work. So I would say that if in the next year we don't make progress on a World Bank for environment as well as development, not at the expense of poverty alleviation, but because climate change hits the poorest countries most, then we will be failing in our duty. You know, in the 1940s, Keynes, the British economist, when he first put his great ideas in the 1930s, at the Treasury, where I used to work as Chancellor, I saw a book when I arrived, which How We Can Conquer Unemployment was his book. And the civil servant had marked on it these great new ideas that we now know would have worked, had marked on it inflation, extravagance, bankruptcy. And that was how one great new idea of the 1930s was greeted. When Keynes tried to build the institutions in the 1940s, that are the institutions we've got now, he was rebuffed in many ways. But we now know we need better global institutions, an IMF more like an independent central bank in my view, a World Bank for environment, and a United Nations that at least can grip these four central problems that you must link peacekeeping to stabilization, to reconstruction and to development. Now, if we could do these three things over the next period of time, that would be a start to what I think is even bigger reform necessary of the international institutions.
Prime Minister, in addition to all those challenges you outlined, there was a lot of discussion here on the challenge, the epochal challenge of poverty. Now, what would you suggest to provide sufficient weight to the urgencies, and what measures would you propose?
I believe this is an emergency. If you look at what's going to happen this year, as food prices have gone up pretty dramatically, and as oil and commodity prices have gone up, then so much of the gains that have been made by either debt relief or by the growth rates in Africa are now going to be wiped out. And I think we've got to recognize that the Millennium Development Goals that we set in 2000 will not be met in 2015 unless we recognize that we now have an emergency and we now have to act differently. There is no chance of meeting the education goal for every child to be in school by 2015 on present trends. In fact, it wouldn't even be met by 2115. There is no chance of getting infant mortality cut by 3/4 as we plan to do. On present trends, it couldn't be met for 50 years. And people should not have to be asked to wait 50 years for the action that we promised in 2000. I think there is another way that we can move forward over these next few years, and I'd be very interested in hearing the response, particularly of businesses and NGOs here. We've thought too much of the Millennium Development Goals as something that governments have got to do between governments and governments acting. I think we should see this as a collective endeavour. I think we should summon up all the energies of the private sector, of the NGOs, of faith groups, as well as of governments. I think we should set ourselves year-to-year objectives where private sector initiatives can work alongside government and faith initiatives in relation to schooling and education, water, where the provision of water is not a technological or scientific barrier, it's a barrier of political will, healthcare. I mean, 1 in 7 mothers are dying in Sierra Leone in childbirth, something that is appalling to anybody who sits here in the developed world. But with simple measures, for example, the provision of training for medical staff or people who are basically trained to do medical jobs, you can make a huge difference to that. Now, I think this collective effort has got to be seen as the private sector, the NGOs, faith groups and governments coming together, and I think that would give a new urgency to the Millennium Development Goals being met by 2015.
Prime Minister, you have all the representatives of those groups here in this hall, but I feel particularly the business community has to take its responsibility, and we had yesterday a very important speech of Bill Gates where he highlighted what he calls creative capitalism. Yep. And we are now just taking up the point how to engage the business community in a panel discussion under the heading of corporate global citizenship. So,
corporate social responsibility is changing all the time, and I do applaud these great businesses that have made their corporate social responsibility the core part of the work. Yeah. You know, if you go back to the 1930s, Henry Ford came to Britain in the 1930s and set up his car company in Britain. And the mayor of Dagenham, the town to which he came, thought this was a great opportunity for Henry Ford to give some money. So he sent him a telegram across to Detroit and said, would you give $10,000 to open an old people's home now that you're setting up in Dagenham? And he got no reply. And then he sent him another telegram and said, well, will you give £5,000 for the opening of this old people's home, which would be in your name in Dagenham? He got no reply. And then the mayor of the town simply announced in desperation that Henry Ford had decided to give the money, even though he hadn't got his approval. And Henry Ford arrived in Britain, and he didn't have a clue what to do, being outsmarted by this mayor who had already announced he was giving this philanthropic donation. And so what Henry Ford hit on was this strategy. He would give the money, but he said to the mayor, only on one condition, that you put an inscription outside this old people's home I'm contributing to with a biblical text, St. John chapter 14, verse 1. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Now, that was the old corporate social philanthropy. In Henry Ford's case, I think grudging, an afterthought, and something that he wouldn't normally have done. Corporate social philanthropy and corporate social responsibility has changed dramatically over these years, and it's now such a core part of the business that I firmly believe that if we can work together, just as telecommunications companies in Africa, just as energy companies are doing in relation to the environment, we can actually solve many of the Millennium Development Goal challenges by the private sector and the public sector working together, and we've got to be more innovative. Bill Gates is creative capitalism in doing so, and that's why I applaud the fact that so many businesses are right at the centre of this environmental and development debate.
So let's call them in, and during the times they are joining us, please express your appreciation for your presence here.
Thank you very much.